The Vampire King's autistic son had sent 37 tutors running. They called him impossible, broken, cursed. Then Sadie entered, a maid who'd raised deaf siblings, who moved in predictable patterns, who never once asked him to be different. Within minutes, he was showing her his maps. The king watched from the threshold, his ancient heart cracking. He'd been so busy protecting his son from the world, he'd missed that the world needed his son's truth. The study was a corner room on the castle's eastern wing, lined floor to ceiling with maps, historical maps, fantasy maps, maps Tobias had drawn himself with obsessive precision. Colored pencils lay in perfect rows on the desk, each shade organized by wavelength, not name. The young man himself sat rigid in an antique chair, his fingers moving in practiced rhythms against the wooden armrest. Drum, drum, pause, drum, drum, pause. His name was Tobias, and he was 23 years old. He had never had a friend. He had never completed a formal education. He had refused, violently and absolutely, every tutor the Vampire King could summon across 3 centuries of rule. Adrian the king stood in the doorway wearing an expression that had terrified kingdoms into submission, but now carried only the weight of paternal exhaustion. He'd built a throne from bones and blood, had bent the rules of mortality itself through sheer will, and yet he could not reach his own son. The air in the study was thick with tension and old paper dust. Sadie hesitated for only a moment before entering. She carried a cleaning cart, mop, cloths, polish, the mundane tools of invisibility. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. She wore the black uniform of a servant, and her movements were deliberate, rhythmic, predictable. This was her strength. She could make herself into a pattern, into something safe. Her deaf sister had taught her that years ago. Back when Sadie was 9 and her sister Mara was 6 and their mother had just died, Sadie had learned to move through the world in ways that didn't startle, didn't confuse, didn't demand explanation. She began dusting the maps on the wall, moving left to right, top to bottom, 5 gentle swipes with a cloth, pause. 3 swipes, pause, 5 swipes. The rhythm was mathematical, predictable, intentional. Tobias's drumming stopped. "You're going to move the middle map 3 inches to the left," he said without turning. His voice was precise but oddly inflected, each word exactly weighted, as if he'd calculated the exact decibel level required for communication. Sadie didn't correct him. She didn't ask how he knew. She simply continued her pattern. "Am I?" she said. "Yes," Tobias said. "Because you work in thirds. I counted. 5 dusts, pause, 3 dusts, pause, 5 dusts. If you break that pattern, you're lying, and I don't trust lies." Sadie smiled, not the practiced smile of a servant, but genuine recognition. She continued her rhythm, moving through the maps with the same care someone would move through a sacred text. When she reached the middle map, a sprawling, hand-drawn kingdom with cities marked in different colored inks, she paused, counted silently to herself, and moved it exactly 3 inches to the left. The gesture was small, but it carried enormous weight. Sadie had just validated Tobias's observation. She had proven that she told the truth through actions, not words. Tobias turned in his chair. For the first time, his eyes met hers directly. They were pale blue, almost translucent, ringed with the exhaustion of someone who existed in a constant state of sensory overload. "Why did you do that?" he asked. "Because you were right," Sadie said. She continued dusting, not breaking her rhythm. "And because being right deserves to be acknowledged." For 2 hours, they didn't speak beyond the essential. Sadie dusted, Tobias watched. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the prince began to relax. His shoulders dropped away from his ears. His fingers, which had started drumming again, began to move with intention rather than anxiety, tracing patterns on the desk that mirrored his internal mapping system. When Sadie reached the final map on the wall, she paused and turned to him. "This one is different," she said. It was the most elaborate of all the drawings, a city sprawled across a sheet of parchment at least 3 feet wide, every building rendered in obsessive detail, every street labeled with tiny, precise notation. "That's Meriden," Tobias said, and his voice changed. It became less guarded, more animated. "I built it. In my head first, then on the map. It has water systems that work with the geography, not against it. And the defensibility is calculated based on the surrounding terrain. Most kingdoms put their walls in the wrong places. They think about what looks strong rather than what actually protects people." He stood and approached the map, his movements still awkward, but no longer defensive. "The gates should be here, where the valley narrows. The water runs underneath, so siege supplies can't be cut off. But the elevation makes it impossible to attack from above. You'd need to go through the city itself." Sadie listened with complete attention. She didn't interrupt. She didn't correct his intensity or suggest he was spending too much time thinking about fictional kingdoms. She simply listened, and her listening was an act of profound validation. "That's brilliant," she said when he finished. "How long did it take you?" "2 years," Tobias said. "The last tutor said I was wasting time. He said learning mathematics was more important than drawing maps. He said I needed to focus on practical applications." His voice on those last words was bitter. "Maps are practical," Sadie said. "They're how we understand the world. They're how we communicate what we see that others can't." She moved her cart toward the door. "I'll dust the east wall tomorrow. Same time, same pattern. 3 dusts, pause, 5 dusts." Tobias nodded. As Sadie left the study, she began humming, a melody her deaf sister Mara had taught her in sign, a lullaby that had no words but carried every emotion Sadie couldn't articulate. It was the same melody she hummed at 3 o'clock every day, the same one she'd hummed since she was old enough to understand that some people communicated through rhythm and pattern rather than sound. Inside the study, Tobias heard it. His hands stilled, and for the first time in 5 years, something in his chest that had been locked tight began to shift, almost imperceptibly, toward openness. Outside the study, Adrian watched Sadie pass. He saw something he'd stopped allowing himself to hope for. His son, at peace. Not happy, not yet, but at peace. The king's ancient eyes filled with something that looked like tears, though vampires were supposed to have forgotten how to cry centuries ago. The ritual became sacred. Every day at precisely 2:58 p.m., Sadie would enter Tobias's study with her cart. At 3 o'clock p.m., she would begin her melody, the lullaby without words, the one that carried the weight of her sister's silence transformed into song. Tobias would wait by the window, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on the glass. His body arranged in the posture of someone preparing for something precious. By the 3rd week, he was humming with her. His voice was untrained, pitched slightly higher than expected, wavering on the 5th note just as Sadie's did. They weren't in perfect harmony. There was something slightly off, kilter about their blend, but that imperfection was what made it real. That was what made it theirs. One afternoon, as they stood at the window humming, Sadie broke the melody and turned to him. "You know the words," she said. It wasn't a question. Tobias nodded. "You taught them to me, last week, in sign. I have good pattern recognition." He held up his hands and signed the words with the precision of someone who'd practiced in secret. "Your hands know things your voice doesn't yet. Your silence is not emptiness. Wait for the song." Sadie felt something crack open inside her chest. This young man, who'd been called broken by everyone who'd ever tried to teach him, had not only learned the words but had chosen them, had understood their meaning deeply enough to practice them in a language that made them even more beautiful. "Do you want to learn to speak them?" she asked. Tobias hesitated. Speech was harder than sign. Speech required breath control and vocal modulation, and the performance of normalcy, that exhausted him. But he looked at Sadie, really looked at her, and saw only patience, not expectation. He nodded. They worked through it slowly, Sadie speaking each word twice, Tobias repeating, his voice gaining confidence with each phrase. By the time he'd spoken the entire verse, both of them were trembling, not from cold, from the magnitude of what had just happened. A young man who hadn't spoken in complete sentences to anyone outside his father in 5 years had just chosen words and given them meaning. Adrian found them standing at the window with Sadie's hand against the glass and Tobias's hand parallel to hers, separated by the barrier but connected through the gesture of attempt. The king's expression was impossible to read, but something in his eyes shifted when he saw them. "How was your day?" Adrian asked, entering the room with the careful movements of someone approaching something precious that might shatter. "Sadie showed me the melody has meaning in sign," Tobias said, and his father's entire body went rigid. He'd heard his son speak to someone else first. He'd heard the brightness in Tobias's voice, a brightness he'd never managed to summon himself, no matter how he tried. "That's good," Adrian said slowly. "That's very good." He stood in the doorway, unable to cross the threshold into the space his son had created with this human maid. And in that moment, Adrian understood something fundamental. Sometimes the greatest act of love a parent can perform is knowing when to leave. Over the following weeks, Tobias began to emerge. Not in ways that would satisfy the Vampire Council, he still didn't attend formal dinners or perform the social rituals required of a prince. But within the study, within the patterns Sadie had established, Tobias became more fully himself. He showed her the architectural principles behind Meridon. He explained the symbolism in his maps, how each color represented not just geography, but emotion, intention, the story of a kingdom's development. He taught her the systems he'd created for tracking water flow and resource distribution. And Sadie listened. She asked genuine questions. She challenged his logic not to correct him, but to help him deepen his own thinking. One afternoon, Tobias asked her something that made her pause. "Why do you move the way you do?" he said. "Everyone else tries to move normally. It confuses them. But you already move like you understand rhythm." Sadie set down her cloth and sat on the floor, deliberately lowering herself, making herself smaller, less powerful. "I grew up with my deaf sister," she said. "My mother died when she was very small. She was born deaf. And I was the one who had to learn to communicate with her. The hearing world wanted her to be normal, to learn to speak like hearing people. But I learned that she had a language, sign language, that was just as complete, just as beautiful. I learned from her that different doesn't mean less. It means different. So I learned to move in ways that felt safe to her. Predictable patterns, consistent rhythm, no sudden movements, no loud noises unless I warned her first." She looked up at Tobias. "Your father hired me to help you, but what I realized very quickly is that you don't need help being different. You need permission to be exactly who you are. So that's what I'm trying to give you." Tobias was quiet for a long time. "My last tutor said I should learn to mask," he said finally. "He said that if I could just act normal, people would accept me better. He said I needed to develop better social skills, better eye contact, less stim behavior. He said all of this like masking would make me better." He looked at Sadie directly. "But it made me feel like I was disappearing, like the things that make me me were shameful." "They're not," Sadie said. "Your father sees that now. I see that. And I think, deep down, you've always known it." That evening, Adrian summoned Sadie to his private study. The room was lined with books and ancient artifacts, with the weight of centuries pressing down from every corner. The king sat behind an enormous desk, and for a moment Sadie saw him as the vampire nobility must see him, ancient, powerful, terrifying. But when he looked up at her, She saw only a father. "What did you say to him?" Adrian asked. It wasn't accusatory. It was desperate. "He's happy. I haven't seen him happy since he was a child. What did you tell him?" Sadie chose her words carefully. "I told him the truth. That different is not broken. That his way of seeing the world is valuable. That he doesn't need to become someone else to be worth keeping around." Adrian stood and walked to the window. Outside, the castle grounds sprawled beneath moonlight, beautiful and cold and utterly under his dominion. "I spent centuries building this kingdom," he said quietly, "making it safe, making it strong. And I did all of that while believing my son needed to be fixed. I thought love meant forcing him into a shape that fit the world. I never considered that love might mean changing the world to fit him." He turned back to Sadie. "You've given me something I didn't know I'd lost. Permission to love him as he is." The night air was electric with something unspoken. Adrian walked toward Sadie, and for a moment, she understood why humans feared vampires. But then he simply placed his hand on her shoulder, a gesture of gratitude, of recognition, and withdrew. "Continue," he said. "Do whatever you're doing. The council will try to stop you, but continue." What neither of them knew was that the council had already begun to move. In the shadows of the castle, among the ancient vampire nobility, there were those who saw Sadie's influence over Tobias not as healing, but as infiltration. They whispered about human weakness corrupting the bloodline. They spoke of a maid who'd somehow become indispensable, dangerous, a security risk, and they began to make plans. 3 months into her employment, Sadie had transformed not just Tobias, but the entire rhythm of the castle. The study, which had previously been a place of conflict and failure, became a sanctuary of genuine learning. The prince was now eating regular meals, sleeping better, engaging with household staff, rather than retreating from them entirely. Adrian noticed that Tobias had begun to help the groundskeepers map the castle gardens, offering architectural advice about optimal irrigation systems. The young man who'd been declared unteachable was teaching others, sharing his unique perspective as a gift rather than an imposition. But with each small victory, the danger increased proportionally. On a cold morning in early winter, Adrian called Sadie to his private chambers. Not unusual, but the timing was different. The urgency in his summoning notice different. When she arrived, she found not just the king, but also Marcus, the senior vampire counselor, a man whose beauty was marred only by the absolute emptiness of his eyes. "Sadie," Adrian began, and his voice carried the weight of decision already made. "The council has raised concerns about your position in the castle. They question the appropriateness of a human having such close contact with the prince. They question your loyalty." Sadie felt the blood drain from her face, but she kept her expression steady. In her childhood, she'd learned to read power dynamics through her sister's eyes, literally, the way Mara watched the hearing world that excluded her. She knew how to remain invisible in plain sight. "I am here to serve," Sadie said carefully. "I tend to the prince's chambers and his study. I've done nothing inappropriate." "You've done everything inappropriate," Marcus said smoothly. "You've made him emotionally dependent on you. You've encouraged him to reject his role as heir. You've positioned yourself as his confidant, when you're nothing but a servant." The words were calculated to wound, and they did. But worse was the implication underneath. That her presence was dangerous, that her influence was a threat, that she would be removed. Adrian's expression remained neutral, but Sadie saw his hands clench slightly, the only tell that he was angry. "Sadie remains," Adrian said, and his voice dropped into the register of absolute authority. "She is under my protection. Any further questions about her position in this castle can be directed through me, and I assure you the answer will not change." Marcus stood, his smile sharp and full of fangs. "Very well, Your Majesty. We merely wanted to express the Council's concerns. Surely you understand we act only in the kingdom's best interest." After he left, Adrian's entire body relaxed as if strings had been cut. He sank into a chair and looked at Sadie with an expression somewhere between gratitude and despair. "I can protect you from the council for now," he said. "But you need to understand what this means. By aligning with me openly, by my acknowledging your importance, I've made you a target. They'll move against you if they think it will weaken me. They'll use you to pressure me into making decisions that benefit them." Sadie sat across from him, and for the first time, she spoke not as a servant, but as an equal. "What do they want?" she asked. Adrian stood and walked to a mirror, an act he rarely allowed himself. Vampires didn't cast reflections in classical mythology, but the modern world had complicated that. Adrian's reflection stared back at him, beautiful and terrible, marked by centuries of accumulated loss. "They want me to seem weak," he said, "or they want me to seem ruthless. Either way works for them. If I appear emotionally compromised by my love for my son, by my trust in you, they can argue for a regent, for a council of advisors, for a slow dismantling of my authority. If I appear ruthless, willing to hurt anyone who gets close to me, they can argue I'm dangerous and need to be controlled. It's a perfect trap." He turned back to her. "But I'm not willing to abandon either of you to avoid it." That evening, Tobias found Sadie in the East Tower, a part of the castle most people avoided. It was old, unused, with ancient protections layered into its stones, wards that only vampire magic could have created. "You're scared," Tobias said. It wasn't a question. His sensory perception, once a liability in social situations, now served as an emotional barometer that most people couldn't disguise against. "Yes," Sadie said. There was no point in lying to him. "The council doesn't want me here. They think I'm bad for you." "They're wrong," Tobias said. He approached the window and looked out at the moonlit grounds. "The council thinks everyone should be like them. Powerful, ancient, hungry. But you taught me that there are other ways to be. Other ways to have value." He turned to look at Sadie. "I won't let them take you away." The innocence in his statement broke something in Sadie's heart. He had no idea that his father was a king, that the decisions he made could reshape kingdoms, that love in this castle was as dangerous as it was necessary. She placed her hand on his shoulder and made a silent promise. She would not abandon him either. The next day, Adrian appeared in the study at an unusual time, carrying a small object wrapped in cloth. He placed it in Sadie's palm, and when she unwrapped it, she found a key, ancient, ornate, made of silver and marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly. "This opens the East Tower," Adrian said quietly. "There's a passage that leads beyond the castle walls, through the mountain paths, to the ancient roads. If the council moves against me, if they try to take Tobias or use him against me, you use this key. You go to the tower, you go through the passage, and you don't stop until you reach the merchant city of Corinth. I have people there. They'll protect you." Sadie's fingers closed around the key, and it was warm, as if Adrian had held it for a long time, had made his peace with what it represented. "I don't want to leave," she said. "I know," Adrian said. "But I need you to know you can. I need you to have a choice that the council can't take from you." That evening, Tobias hummed his melody with a new intensity, and Sadie realized he understood more than he'd let on. He'd overheard the conversation. He understood the danger. And he was choosing at age 23 to stand beside them anyway. The three of them, a human maid, an autistic prince, and an ancient vampire king, had formed a triad that the old powers in the castle could not tolerate. By the end of the week, Felix, a younger vampire counselor with ambitions that reached far beyond his current station, began making quiet overtures to the lesser houses. He began suggesting that perhaps the kingdom would be stronger under different leadership. He began suggesting that perhaps Adrian had become too sentimental, too human in his concerns. And in the shadows of the castle, plans began to solidify into action. The great council chamber was designed to intimidate. high ceilings carved from black stone, windows that filtered the winter light into shades of gray and silver. And at the center, a table where the oldest and most powerful vampire nobles in the kingdom assembled to determine the fate of lesser beings. Adrian sat at the head of the table, his position unquestioned but increasingly scrutinized. Around him, the council members watched with the patience of predators, waiting for the first sign of weakness. Marcus brought the accusation. His voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of someone who'd manipulated kingdoms for centuries. Your Majesty, the Council has discovered communications between your human servant and external parties, detailed maps of the castle, guard rotations, the prince's daily schedule. We have reason to believe she may be compromised, working with external forces to gather intelligence. He placed sealed letters on the table. Each one was addressed to Sadie's sister, Mara, who lived in a village 3 provinces away. Each one contained exactly what Marcus claimed: descriptions of the castle, observations about routine, architectural details. The implication was clear: Sadie was a spy, a security risk, a threat to the kingdom's stability. Tobias stood. In a room full of ancient, powerful vampires, a young autistic man rose with all the dignity of someone who'd been preparing for this moment. He walked to Sadie's side, the two of them now united against the assembled power of centuries. She tells the truth, Tobias said, and his voice didn't shake. Everything. About the maps, about my schedule, about me. Unlike everyone else in this room, she doesn't hide it. She doesn't pretend. She doesn't use it as a weapon. He looked directly at Marcus. You call that betrayal. I call it honesty. And I trust her more than I trust any of you. The hall went silent. It was the kind of silence that preceded either violence or transformation. And everyone could feel it. A prince had just rejected not only the council, but the fundamental logic of the vampire world, the idea that strength came from secrecy, from hiding your nature, from never revealing what could be used against you. Adrian stood. His movement was fluid, controlled, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. My son has spoken, the king said, and his voice was quiet, which made it infinitely more terrifying than if he'd shouted. The accusations are without merit. The letters to his sister are proof not of betrayal but of trust. Sadie speaks truth where others speak manipulation. She has earned her place in this castle through demonstrated integrity, not through bloodline or age or political maneuvering. This council is dismissed. The council members exchanged glances, calculating odds, reassessing positions. For a moment, it seemed the confrontation might escalate into violence. Then Felix stood, and the younger vampire's smile was sharp as broken glass. Of course, Your Majesty. We merely wanted to ensure the kingdom's security. We meant no offense. He left the chamber, followed by the other council members. But his departure carried a weight. He was not accepting defeat. He was acknowledging the temporary victory and beginning to plan the next phase of his campaign. In the corridor outside the chamber, Felix paused and allowed a thin smile to cross his beautiful face. The king had made an error. By standing so openly with the human, by declaring her unquestionably trustworthy, Adrian had revealed his greatest vulnerability. He could be moved by emotion. And emotion, in the hands of someone like Felix, was a weapon of devastating potential. Over the following weeks, the tension in the castle thickened like winter storm clouds. Felix began recruiting allies among the younger vampire houses, those hungry for power and frustrated by Adrian's centuries of rule. He began spreading rumors. The king was losing his edge, becoming soft, allowing a human to influence his judgment. He began suggesting that the prince's condition, his autism, his difference, was somehow a sign of curse, of weakness in the bloodline. And most dangerously, he began suggesting that perhaps it was time for new leadership. Adrian felt the walls closing in. The council was losing confidence in him. The lesser houses were becoming restless. and every move he made to protect Tobias and Sadie was read as further evidence that he was compromised. He called a meeting with his most trusted generals, ancient vampires who'd served him for centuries, who understood the deeper rules of power. "Felix is moving against us," Adrian told them, and for the first time in their service, they heard uncertainty in his voice. "He's using my son against me, using my attachment to Sadie as evidence of weakness." Marcus, the senior counselor, was among those gathered. He leaned forward slightly. "He's not wrong about the danger," Marcus said carefully. "Your Majesty, you've broken the cardinal rule of vampire leadership. You've allowed yourself to feel too much. In our world, attachment is weakness, love is leverage." Adrian's eyes turned red, the sign of his vampire nature fully activated, dangerous. "Then perhaps our world is wrong," he said quietly. "Perhaps what I've learned from my son and from Sadie is that attachment is not weakness. It's the only thing that makes us more than the monsters we pretend not to be." He stood and walked to a mirror. His reflection stared back at him, beautiful and ancient and desperately, terribly human. "I'm going to make a choice," Adrian continued. "I'm going to acknowledge that I love my son. I'm going to declare that Sadie is under my protection and my trust. And if Felix or anyone else in this council sees that as weakness, then they're welcome to challenge me. But let them understand what they're challenging. Not a king who's compromised, but a father who's finally found what matters." Marcus exchanged glances with the other generals. What Adrian was proposing was radical, dangerous, and possibly suicidal. A vampire king who admitted to love, who aligned himself openly with a human, who prioritized emotional connection over strategic positioning, that was a king who'd handed his enemies a blueprint for his destruction. But it was also a king who might finally have become something more than a monster. Late that night, Tobias found Adrian in the study, surrounded by maps and documents and the weight of impossible decisions. Father and son stood in silence for several minutes, then Tobias placed his hand on Adrian's shoulder, a gesture he'd never made before. "You're doing the right thing," Tobias said, "even though it's dangerous." "Especially because it's dangerous," Adrian replied. "That's what makes it matter." Outside, in the castle courtyard, Felix stood beneath the winter stars and began making his final preparations. He'd soon have enough support among the lesser houses to force a formal challenge to Adrian's rule. Within weeks, the entire kingdom would be engulfed in civil war. And in the chaos of that conflict, Felix would finally have his opportunity. The great hall was packed for the assembly, with vampire nobility from across the kingdom arrayed in formal dress, all beauty and danger and barely concealed hunger. Adrian sat on his throne, elevated above the assembled crowd, but everyone could feel the tension radiating from him. Tobias sat to his right, and Sadie stood behind them both, the three of them a unified front, and every vampire in the hall understood what that unity represented. A fundamental break with tradition, a rejection of the old ways. The final course of the ceremonial dinner was being served when Felix stood. His voice rang out across the chamber, smooth as poison. "Your Majesty, there is a matter the council feels compelled to raise before the assembled houses. We have discovered communications between your human servant and various external parties. We have evidence that she has been communicating military intelligence regarding the castle's defenses." He produced a set of documents, carefully selected, carefully edited, that presented Sadie's letters to her sister as something far more sinister than they actually were. The context had been stripped away. The innocent details were presented as tactical information, and the implication hung in the air like a threat. A human had been allowed into the castle's inner sanctum, and she'd been gathering secrets. Before Adrian could respond, Sadie stepped forward. She didn't flee. She didn't hide. She walked to the center of the hall and stood before the assembled vampire nobility of the kingdom. "Those letters are mine," she said, and her voice was clear and steady. "I wrote them to my sister, who lives 3 provinces away. I wrote them because I'm proud of the prince's intelligence. I mentioned details about the castle because I wanted her to understand the magnitude of his genius. The only conspiracy here is love. I love this prince. I love this family. And if you're going to punish me for that, then you're not the noble houses I thought you were. You're predators feeding on anything vulnerable, and you're terrified of anyone who might make you feel something true." The silence that followed was absolute. In a world built on deception and strategic maneuvering, a human had just spoken truth to power. Tobias stood. He walked to Sadie's side, placing his hand on her shoulder in the gesture she'd taught him, the sign of trust and acceptance he'd learned in their study. "I trust her," Tobias said. "She's the first person in my life who told me I was exactly right the way I am. She's the first person who didn't ask me to be someone else. She's the first person who showed me that different isn't broken. I want her to stay. If she leaves, I leave. I don't care about the throne. I care about not being alone." The hall erupted, gasps, angry murmurs, the sound of vampire nobility processing the fact that the heir had just rejected his birthright. Adrian stood slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was the voice of a predator, ancient and dangerous and absolutely resolved. "My son has spoken. The council is dismissed. Any further discussion of this matter will be conducted through me, and I assure you the outcome will not change." He descended from the throne and stood beside Tobias and Sadie, the 3 of them unified against the assembled power of the vampire kingdom. For a moment, it seemed violence might erupt. Felix stepped forward, his hand moving toward a weapon concealed in his robes. But he stopped when he saw Adrian's eyes fully red, when he saw the power radiating from the ancient king. Felix understood in that moment that he'd miscalculated. He'd expected Adrian to choose the throne over his son. Instead, Adrian had chosen his son over everything else. The vampire counselor smiled, a sharp, predatory expression full of fangs. "A remarkable display, Your Majesty," Felix said smoothly. "I'm sure the other houses will understand your devotion." He left the hall, but his departure was a promise. This wasn't over. It was merely beginning. As the nobility filed out, some casting sympathetic glances toward Adrian, others looking away to avoid any association with what the king had just done, Marcus approached the 3 of them. The senior counselor was old, ancient beyond reckoning, and his eyes held the weight of centuries. "You've made a dangerous choice," he said quietly. "The council will not accept this. Felix is already moving among the lesser houses. You've created a crisis." "I know," Adrian said simply. "But my son will not be used as leverage anymore. Sadie will not be hunted because of her loyalty. And if that creates a crisis, then so be it." Over the following days, the crisis deepened. Felix began formal negotiations with the lesser vampire houses, positioning himself as the alternative to Adrian's increasingly sentimental rule. He began collecting allies, building support, preparing for a formal challenge that would tear the kingdom apart. But in the East Tower, Adrian revealed something he'd been holding in reserve. He showed Tobias and Sadie evidence of Felix's corruption, embezzlement from the kingdom's treasury, bribery of minor lords, a secret army being assembled. It was the proof Adrian had needed, the ammunition that would shift the narrative from emotional vulnerability to concrete threat. "We don't run," Adrian told them. "We fight, but we use truth, not violence. We expose what Felix really is, and we let the kingdom decide." Tobias absorbed this with the careful attention he brought to all strategic thinking. "The truth will be enough?" he asked. "Not always," Adrian admitted. "But in this case it should be. Because I'm not just fighting for my throne. I'm fighting for the right of my son to exist exactly as he is. And that's a battle the truth can win." The throne room was packed again, but this time the assembly carried a different energy. Adrian stood before the vampire kingdom and presented evidence. Ledgers showing Felix's embezzlement, communications revealing his bribery of minor lords, architectural plans for a secret army he'd been assembling. Each document was irrefutable, each revelation adding another layer of condemnation. The younger vampire counselor's face remained composed, but his eyes revealed the calculation happening beneath. He'd been exposed, and exposure in the vampire world meant exile or death. Marcus stood, and to everyone's shock, voted to strip Felix of his titles and holdings. The council erred, the senior counselor said, his ancient voice carrying the weight of decision. We allowed ambition to mask itself as principle. If we remove the king for love, we remove the one thing that makes us different from the monsters we pretend not to be. I vote that Adrian remain, and that his decisions regarding his son and his household be beyond council interference. Other houses followed. The momentum shifted. Within hours, Felix was arrested by Adrian's guards and removed from the kingdom, his vast holdings seized and redistributed. The civil war that had been brewing in the shadows dissipated like morning mist under sunlight, as Felix's supporters, realizing their patron had fallen and that continued resistance would mark them as complicit in his crimes, quickly distanced themselves from the disgraced counselor and pledged renewed loyalty to the throne. The great families who had whispered in corners and plotted in private chambers now stood in open court, one after another, declaring their allegiance to Adrian with carefully worded speeches that managed to condemn Felix's treachery without admitting they had ever entertained his proposals. Lady Seraphina of House Nightshade was among the first, her silver hair catching the torchlight as she approached the dais with measured steps. Her voice clear and unwavering as she stated that her house had always valued the ancient traditions of the vampire kingdom, traditions that included respect for the sovereign's right to govern his own household without interference from those who would use council procedures as weapons for personal advancement. Lord Theron of House Blackwater followed, his massive frame somehow conveying both strength and contrition as he admitted that he had been approached by Felix with proposals that seemed reasonable on their surface, but were clearly designed to undermine the very foundations of vampire society, and that he deeply regretted entertaining even momentary consideration of such schemes. The younger lords and ladies, those who had risen to power in the last century or two, were particularly vocal in their denunciations of Felix, perhaps sensing that this moment represented a generational shift in vampire politics, a movement away from the rigid hierarchies and Byzantine manipulations that had characterized the previous era towards something that might allow for adaptation and evolution. Adrian watched them all with eyes that had seen centuries of such declarations, knowing that some spoke from genuine conviction, while others merely read the changing winds and adjusted their sails accordingly. But he accepted each pledge with the grace expected of a king, understanding that in vampire society, the performance of loyalty was often as important as the loyalty itself. The evidence he had presented was being copied by scribes and distributed throughout the kingdom, ensuring that every vampire who could read would know the extent of Felix's betrayal, and those who couldn't read would hear it from those who could, the story spreading through the realm like blood through veins until it became part of the collective memory of the kingdom. The ledgers were particularly damning, showing not just embezzlement, but a pattern of it stretching back decades, funds siphoned from royal coffers and noble estates, money that should have gone to maintaining the kingdom's infrastructure, instead diverted to Felix's private accounts and used to build his network of influence. The communications revealed the mechanisms of corruption in meticulous detail, letters to minor lords offering titles and land in exchange for their support when the time came to challenge Adrian's rule, promises of power and position in a new order where Felix would serve as the power behind a puppet king or perhaps claim the throne for himself. The architectural plans were perhaps most chilling, showing a compound hidden in the northern mountains where Felix had been training a private force of vampire warriors, Not the ceremonial guards that noble houses were permitted to maintain, but a genuine army equipped and trained for conquest, complete with weapons stores and strategic plans for seizing key positions throughout the kingdom. Marcus's vote had been the turning point, the moment when the tide became unstoppable. Because if even the senior counselor who had stood beside Felix in challenging Adrian's decisions regarding Elijah now turned against him, it signaled to everyone present that Felix's position was indefensible. The ancient vampire's words about love and what separated them from monsters resonated through the throne room with the force of prophecy, striking at the heart of the question that had divided the vampire kingdom. Were they creatures of pure reason and tradition, bound by laws that permitted no exception and brooked no sentiment? Or were they beings capable of growth and change, able to recognize that the capacity for love and connection was not weakness, but the very thing that elevated them above mindless predators? Adrian had not expected Marcus to support him, had prepared himself for continued opposition from that quarter, so when the senior counselor rose and spoke those words, he felt something shift inside himself, a tension he hadn't fully acknowledged, releasing its grip on his chest. The other houses followed like dominoes falling in sequence, each declaration of support making the next easier, creating a cascade of realignment that transformed the political landscape of the kingdom in the space of a single evening. Within hours, Felix was arrested by Adrian's guards, the same warriors who had protected the throne room during the previous assembly, now marching into Felix's estate with arrest warrants sealed with the king's own sigil. Finding the younger counselor in his study surrounded by papers he was desperately trying to burn, evidence he hoped to destroy before it could be used against him. But he was too late. The case already made, his fate already sealed. The arrest itself was almost anticlimactic, Felix offering no resistance as the guards placed silver-inlaid manacles on his wrists. His face a mask of aristocratic disdain even in defeat, refusing to show fear or regret as he was led from his ancestral home for the last time. His vast holdings were seized and redistributed according to ancient protocols, the estates and titles that had accumulated over generations, now parceled out to houses that had remained loyal or had turned against Felix quickly enough to demonstrate their allegiance to the throne. The redistribution was handled with careful consideration for both justice and politics, ensuring that no single house gained enough to become a new threat while rewarding those whose support had been crucial during the crisis. Some of Felix's lands went to the royal holdings, strengthening the throne's direct power and providing resources that could be used for the kingdom's benefit rather than individual enrichment. Other properties were granted to minor houses who had stood firm against Felix's blandishments, elevating their status and creating a new tier of nobles whose rise was directly tied to their loyalty to Adrian. The process took days to complete, with legal scholars poring over ancient texts to ensure every transfer was conducted according to proper forms. But the outcome was never in doubt once Marcus had declared his position and the other houses had followed his lead, transforming what might have been a protracted legal battle into an efficient execution of vampire justice.